I still can't quite believe what I saw that morning. Part of me wishes I had never left camp, never walked down to that river, but another part knows I witnessed something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was the 5th day I'd been alone in the wilderness, deep in the remote Pacific Northwest. I had driven 8 hours from home and then hiked another 12 miles into country so isolated you could go weeks without seeing another person. There was no cell service, and the closest neighbors were black bears and mountain lions. I was out there hunting moose, hoping to fill my freezer for the winter. The first few days dragged by slowly. I saw plenty of signs, tracks, scat, rub marks on trees, but nothing I could actually shoot. By the 5th day, I was starting to lose hope, thinking I'd have to pack up and head home empty-handed. That morning, I woke before dawn as usual. My little tent was soaked with dew and the temperature had dropped to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. I stayed bundled in my sleeping clothes for warmth, and after 5 days without a real wash, I was feeling pretty rough. My hair was greasy, my skin sticky, and I could smell myself every time I moved. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest wake up. Birds started calling, and somewhere far off, I thought I heard the faint bugle of a moose, though it was too distant to be sure. Then I remembered the river. I'd heard it every night since setting up camp, the steady sound of running water about a quarter mile to the west. I figured I'd go check it out, maybe try my luck fishing or at least wash off some of the trail grime. A dip in the cold mountain water actually sounded pretty good right then. So I crawled out of the tent, slipped on my boots, and grabbed my rifle. Out there, even on the way to the river, you don't go anywhere unarmed. Too many things have teeth and claws. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and started making my way through the woods. The forest was thick, mostly Douglas fir and western hemlock with a few cedars mixed in. The undergrowth was dense too, ferns, devil's club, and moss-covered deadfall everywhere. Every step made some kind of noise, no matter how careful I was. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, the crunch of dry pine needles underfoot. The sound of the river grew louder. It took me about 15 minutes to get close. The trees began to thin near the water, and I could see the dim gray morning light filtering through the canopy ahead. Then I stopped. I don't even know why exactly. Instinct, maybe. Something made me freeze mid-step, one foot still in the air. Maybe I'd heard something that didn't belong. Maybe it was just a feeling. But every nerve in my body suddenly screamed at me to stay quiet and pay attention. I slowly lowered my foot, careful not to make a sound. Then I heard a thump. It wasn't the steady rush of the river. It was something else, something deliberate. Then came a splash, and another. Between the splashes came deep, low, raspy growls, sounds unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My heart started pounding. I crouched and crept forward a few yards, hiding behind a thick cedar trunk, and looked toward the river. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were 3 of them. 3 enormous figures standing in the shallow water, bent over, completely focused on what they were doing. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of it. I thought they might be bears, but bears don't stand upright like that. They don't have those proportions. They were huge, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered head to toe in long, dark, tangled hair, soaked and hanging in thick clumps. Their shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than any man's, wider even than a bear's, and they were fishing. I squatted behind the cedar, about 50 yards from the riverbank, and just watched, my hands trembling. My rifle was still slung over my shoulder. I didn't even think to grab it. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The nearest one was maybe 30 yards away, across the river. I could see it clearly in the dim morning light. Its back was to me, but I could see the muscles shifting beneath the wet hair, powerful, rolling movements as it shifted its weight and positioned itself. The arms were incredibly long, hanging well below the knees. The hands were massive. It stood motionless in the water, which reached halfway up its thighs. The current was strong, white water swirling around the rocks, but the creature didn't seem affected at all. It just stood there, solid as stone, staring down into the river. Then, in a flash almost too fast to follow, it swung its arm down. A splash erupted, and when it raised its arm again, it was holding a fish. A big one. It looked like a salmon, maybe 15 or 20 pounds. The creature lifted it to its chest and bit into it. It tore into the fish, ripping off a chunk of raw flesh. I felt sick, Not disgusted exactly, more overwhelmed. This wasn't supposed to be real. Things like this weren't supposed to exist. But I was watching it happen. The other two were farther off, near the opposite bank, doing the same thing, standing perfectly still, waiting, then striking into the water with terrifying speed. One of them snatched a salmon while I was watching. It held the fish up high while the third exhaled a loud snort. It wasn't quite a call, not quite a bark, more like an approving grunt, as if they were communicating. That's when it really hit me. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. Something more was going on. They were working together, coordinated, maybe even speaking to each other in their own way. I watched the closest one for about 10 more minutes. In that time, it caught 3 more salmon, each strike as fast and precise as the first. The technique was incredible. It would stand motionless for 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, and then suddenly move. Its arm would plunge into the water and come back up almost every time with a fish. When it missed, it made a low sound and shifted slightly before going still again. The face, when it tilted its head slightly, I caught a glimpse. It wasn't human, but it wasn't ape either. Something in between. The nose was flat and wide. Heavy brow ridges jutted out, shadowing the eyes. The jaw was powerful, the mouth wide. When it bit into the fish, I could see large teeth, off-white with a yellow tinge. But the eyes, even from that distance, even in the dim morning light, I could tell they were different. They weren't blank or lifeless like an animal's. There was something behind them, awareness, intelligence. The sight made my skin crawl. I don't know how long I crouched there, watching. Time seemed to slow. 15 minutes, maybe 20. The sun was climbing higher, light spilling through the treetops and making the river glimmer. The 3 creatures kept fishing, methodical and efficient. Every few minutes, one of them pulled something from the water. They didn't eat all the fish. They left some on the bank. I could see a small pile forming across the river. Then everything changed. The closest one, the one on my side, began making low, rumbling sounds. The other 2 answered with the same noise. They started moving toward the far bank, wading through water that should have knocked them off balance. Even where the river was clearly 4 or 5 feet deep, it only came up to their waists. They climbed out on the opposite shore, water streaming off their bodies. For the first time, I saw them fully upright. They were enormous, at least 8 feet tall, the largest closer to 9 or 10. Their bodies were thick and powerful, all muscle beneath the hair. They didn't knuckle walk like apes. They moved upright, backs slightly hunched, but unmistakably bipedal. One of them bent to pick up the pile of fish. It held them easily in one hand, as if they weighed nothing. Then they started moving into the forest on their side of the river. And that's when I made the dumbest decision of my life. I decided to follow them. I don't know what I was thinking, truth is. I wasn't thinking. Something inside me took over. Curiosity, disbelief, the need to be sure this was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. I'd been hunting and tracking for 20 years. I knew how to move quietly in the woods, how to read sign. These things were huge, leaving a trail even a child could follow. How hard could it be to track them from a distance, see where they went, maybe find proof of what they were, maybe even get a photo if I was lucky. So I waited until they disappeared into the trees before I moved. I stepped out from behind the cedar and down to the riverbank. The water was cold, clear, and fast. I could see exactly where they'd stood, the deep impressions left in the sandy bottom, still visible even as the current washed over them. I looked for a spot to cross. About 40 yards upstream, the river widened and looked shallower. I worked my way along the bank to that point. Even there, it was still deep, probably up to my chest at the center, and the current was strong, but I was committed. The cold hit me like a punch. The water was glacial, probably no warmer than 40 degrees. It soaked through my boots instantly, then my pants. Each step the current shoved against me, trying to throw me off balance. The rocks underfoot were slick with moss. By the time I reached the middle, the water was up to my armpits. I held my rifle high over my head to keep it dry. The current was so strong I had to lean into it, inching forward. For a few seconds I thought I was going to be swept away. My foot slipped on a rock and I almost went under. But I made it. I slogged up the far bank, gasping, water streaming off me, my whole body shaking from the cold. I stood there a moment, breathing hard, the morning air chilling my soaked clothes. Then I turned toward the forest and started looking for their trail. It wasn't hard to find. The underbrush where they'd passed was crushed flat. Saplings were bent or broken, and the footprints huge, in the soft earth, at least twice the length of mine and much deeper. I followed. The trail climbed uphill away from the river. They were moving at a steady pace, not running but not slow either. The tracks stayed close together, showing they were traveling as a group. I kept my distance, maybe 200 yards back, moving carefully from tree to tree. Every few minutes I stopped to listen. Sometimes I could hear them ahead, branches breaking, the heavy movement of something massive pushing through the brush. At one point, I heard one of them let out a soft call, and another answer from somewhere ahead. The sound echoed through the forest, impossible to pinpoint. As I followed, I began noticing strange things. Really strange things. On several tall trees, 6 or 7 feet above the ground, the bark had been stripped away in long vertical gashes, as if something tall had reached up and clawed at the wood. Some of the marks were old, the exposed wood weathered and gray. Others were fresh, pale, still oozing sap. I stopped to examine one of the trees more closely. The gouges were deep, maybe half an inch into the wood. Whatever had done this was strong and tall enough that I had to stretch my arm as high as I could just to touch the lowest of the marks. These things were taller than I'd realized when I saw them down by the river. Then I saw the first sign, at least. That's what I thought it was. Hanging from a low branch was a bundle of twisted grass and small sticks woven into a rough circle. Attached to it were tiny bones, bird bones maybe, and a few feathers. It turned slowly in the breeze, and something about it made my skin crawl. It was deliberate. Someone or something had made it and hung it there on purpose. As I continued following the trail, I began seeing more of them. Every 100 yards or so, another one dangled from a branch. Each one was slightly different, but all shared the same intent. Some had more bones woven in, others included what looked like dried berries or seed husks. A few had small animal skulls, maybe squirrels or rabbits, tied in the center with what looked like twisted plant fiber. These weren't the works of ordinary animals. They were making objects, marking territory, decorating, communicating. I didn't know what these symbols meant, but they meant something. Each one had taken time, planning, and fine motor skill to make. The weaving was crude but purposeful. The knots holding them to the branches were tight and secure. I moved on, following the tracks deeper into their territory. About 1.5 miles from the river, I found something that made me stop cold. On the ground, between 2 large trees, was a ring of stones. Not random stones, carefully arranged in a perfect circle about 6 feet across. In the middle lay a pile of blackened wood and ash, a fire pit. I knelt to take a closer look. The stones were smooth river rocks, all about the same size, placed with precision. The ash inside was old, weathered by rain, but I could still see layers beneath the surface. This spot had been used many times. They had cooked here, gathered here, maybe even held some kind of ritual here. The ground around the fire ring was smooth and packed down, as if heavy feet had trampled it for years. This was a meeting place used often and by more than one of them. I looked up and noticed more of the hanging symbols in the trees around the circle. Dozens of them suspended at different heights. Some were intricately made, with multiple layers of woven material. Others were simple, just a tuft of grass tied in a knot. The effect was almost decorative, as if they'd adorned this place to make it special in some way. My heart pounded in my chest. I was standing in what had to be their camp, their gathering site. If they came back and found me here, I'd be trapped. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to see more. I stepped over the fire ring and followed the trail beyond it. The tracks led me through a stretch of forest where the brush had been trampled down into clear paths. Several of the paths branched off in different directions, forming a kind of network. These weren't deer or moose trails. They were too wide, too consistent. They'd been made by something that walked upright. I followed the main path, the one with the freshest tracks. Every 30 or 40 feet, I spotted more signs of their passage. A young tree bent completely over, pinned to the ground by a heavy stone. A fallen log had been dragged aside and propped upright against another tree. Small stacks of stones were arranged in deliberate patterns, almost like cairns. Then I heard them again closer this time. I froze and listened. They were making sounds, the same deep rumbles and low growls I'd heard by the river, but now I could distinguish more variation. Different tones, different rhythms. One would make a sound and another would respond, back and forth like a conversation. I crept forward, moving from tree to tree, barely breathing. Through the branches ahead, I caught glimpses of movement. I eased closer, maybe 60 yards away, and found a thick patch of ferns to hide behind. There were 3 of them, standing in a small clearing, and they weren't just standing around, they were doing something. The largest one was holding a big piece of bark, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It examined the bark, turning it over in its hands, then set it down on a flat rock and picked up a smaller stone with a sharp edge. It began scraping at the bark, carving deliberate lines, shaping it. The other 2 were busy as well. One was twisting long plant fibers together, braiding them into a rope. I was stunned at how nimble its massive fingers were, surprisingly dexterous for something that size. The smallest one was gathering more bark from a nearby dead tree, peeling off large sheets and bringing them back to the others. I watched them work for about 10 minutes. They were focused, methodical. The big one occasionally grunted, holding up the shaped bark for the others to see. Another would respond with a low rumble agreement maybe, or correction. Then it would go back to scraping. They were making something, tools perhaps, or containers. The bark pieces looked like they could hold water or food. The rope could serve a dozen purposes. This wasn't mere instinct, it was craftsmanship, foresight, planning for future needs. The smallest one finished gathering bark and sat down beside the others, taking a piece and trying to copy their movements. Its motions were clumsy, unpracticed. The big one noticed and gave a short grunt. It reached over, took the bark gently, demonstrated the scraping motion, and handed it back. Teaching. I felt chills run up my arms. I was watching a parent or an elder teaching a younger one how to make tools, passing down knowledge. This was culture. This was society. The largest one finally finished shaping its piece of bark and set it aside with several others that were already complete. Then it stood and stretched, raising both arms high overhead. I could hear its joints pop even from 60 meters away. It rolled its massive shoulders and exhaled a sound that was almost a sigh. Then it turned and looked directly toward where I was hiding. I froze, didn't breathe, didn't blink. The ferns I crouched behind weren't thick enough. If it had truly seen me, there'd be no question. But after a few seconds, it turned away again. It hadn't spotted me, just happened to glance in my direction. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. The 3 gathered up the finished pieces, carved bark, coiled rope, and began moving again. I waited until they were well ahead before following. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I'd been lucky. Too lucky. I should have turned back. But I couldn't. The trail sloped upward now. We had climbed maybe 500 feet above the river. My legs burned, my clothes were still damp and rubbed against my skin with every step, but I pressed on, keeping a safe distance and using every bit of cover I could find. As we ascended, I noticed more structures. Trees broken off about 10 feet up, the tops laid across other trunks like crude beams. Branches intertwined between standing trees, forming rough walls or barriers. One stretch of trail passed beneath what I could only describe as an archway. 2 saplings bent toward each other, their tops lashed together with what looked like vines. The entire area had been altered, shaped. They had built things here, not elaborate structures but deliberate modifications to their surroundings. This was their territory, and they had made it their own. The trail grew steeper as we climbed the hillside. The forest thickened, the brush closed in, my breathing grew ragged. My wet clothes clung cold and heavy against my skin, but I kept moving. At one point, I came to a place where several small trees had been bent and woven together, forming a crude arch over the path. The trunks were still alive, curved in strange, unnatural ways and bound tightly with thick vines. Up close, I could see how firmly the vines were twisted. This had taken real strength and careful planning. I ducked beneath the arch and kept going. My heart was pounding not just from the climb, but from what I was seeing. This was their territory. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence they lived here. The that they had shaped this part of the forest, and I was walking straight into the heart of it. About a mile from the river, I saw them again. The trail opened into a small clearing, and I dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log at the edge of the trees. All three were there, maybe 70 yards ahead. They had stopped in the clearing and were doing something with the fish they'd caught. I watched as they tore the salmon apart, piece by piece. But they weren't just eating. The biggest one, the one the others clearly deferred to, was dividing the fish. It would tear off a chunk and hand it to one of the others, then another piece to the third, then take a bite itself. They were sharing, distributing the food evenly. I watched as they passed pieces back and forth, grunting softly between bites. The smallest one, and by small, I mean still over 6.5 feet tall, stayed close to the largest. At one point, the big one reached out and touched the smaller one's shoulder. Just a brief touch, but there was something gentle in it, almost affectionate. My eyes stung. I didn't even know why. Maybe because what I was seeing was beyond anything I'd imagined, so strange yet so undeniably real. Maybe because, whatever these things were, it was obvious they had relationships. They cared for one another. When they finished eating, they started moving again. I let them go ahead before following. We continued upward, the terrain getting rougher. The trees began to thin, and patches of granite jutted from the mountainside. More markings appeared, fresh bark stripped from trunks, gouges higher up than any human could reach. Then I saw something else, a pile of stones stacked deliberately, not by nature. The rocks were arranged in a rough pyramid about 4 feet tall. I was so focused on the ground, on the tracks and landmarks, that I almost didn't notice how quiet the forest had become. The birds had stopped singing. The small animals that usually rustled in the brush were silent. The only sounds were my own breathing and the faint crunch of my boots. That should have been my warning. Prey goes silent when predators are near, and at that moment, I was the prey. But I didn't realize it. I just kept following the trail, eyes locked on the tracks ahead. By now, I was a good 1.5 miles from the river, deep in their territory, and I still thought I was being careful. I still thought I was in control. The trail curved around a large boulder and began sloping down into a narrow ravine. At the bottom, maybe 50 yards away, I could see what looked like the mouth of a cave or a rocky overhang. A dark opening in the gray stone, partly hidden by trees. I stopped at the top of the ravine and crouched to get a better look. Then I decided to move closer just a little, just close enough to see. I took 3 steps, then 4, then 5. My eyes were fixed on that cave entrance, trying to make out anything inside the shadow. I wasn't paying attention to where I was stepping. My boot came down on a dead branch, buried under the leaves. It was dry and brittle, and when my weight hit it, it snapped with a loud crack like a gunshot. The sound echoed through the ravine, through the whole forest, and everything stopped. For 3 long seconds, nothing moved. The world held its breath. Then they appeared. All 3 of them stepped out from the darkness of the cave into the open. They stood still, just as they had by the river, motionless, alert. Their heads turned slowly, scanning the trees, listening. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I pressed myself flat against the boulder behind me, trying to melt into the stone. My rifle still hung over my shoulder, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't move. The big one took a step forward, then another. It was looking up the ravine right toward where I was hiding. Its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air. Then it made a sound, low and thunderous, starting deep in its chest. The other 2 answered, their voices joining in a chorus of deep, vibrating growls. These weren't like the sounds I'd heard before. They were different, alert, aggressive. The big one started up the ravine toward me, not running, but moving with intent. Its eyes scanned the trees. The other 2 spread out to the sides, fanning through the brush. They were hunting. They knew something was here. I had maybe 10 seconds to decide, stay hidden and hope they passed, or run. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, but I forced myself to stay still. If I moved, they'd see me. If I stayed still, maybe they'd miss me. The big one was 20 yards away now, 15. I could see its face clearly, the broad forehead, the flared nostrils, the eyes shifting from side to side. Any second now, I knew those eyes would lock onto mine. At 10 yards, it stopped. It sniffed the air again, slowly turning its head left, then right, and then it looked straight at me. Our eyes met, and in that frozen instant I saw recognition there. It knew exactly where I was and what I was. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then its mouth opened, and it let out a roar that shook the forest. Not a howl, not a scream, a roar deep, furious, primal, echoing through the trees like the sound of the earth itself tearing open. I ran. I burst from my hiding spot and tore through the undergrowth, crashing through ferns and branches, sprinting back the way I'd come. Behind me, I heard them scream. Not human, not animal, something in between. Something ancient and terrifying, a sound from another age. Branches whipped across my face. Thorns shredded my clothes. I vaulted a fallen log and nearly went down on the other side, stumbling against a tree. Behind me, the roars continued, accompanied by the thunder of massive bodies crashing through the forest. All three were chasing me, and they were fast. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were about to give out. The rifle slammed against my back with every stride, the strap biting deep into my show. In a split-second decision, I reached back without stopping, unbuckled the strap, and let it go. The rifle slipped off my shoulder and crashed to the ground behind me. Instantly, I was lighter, faster. I threw everything I had into my legs and hurled myself down the slope. The trees blurred past. The ground dropped steeply, and I half ran, half fell, letting gravity pull me. But the sounds behind me didn't fade. If anything, they were getting closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw movement among the trees. A massive dark shape, darker than the shadows, was tearing through the forest after me. Then, another. They were spreading out, moving parallel through the woods. They weren't just chasing me, they were coordinating, trying to cut me off. I veered right away from the nearest one. A crash echoed to my left as something huge plowed through the trees. They were everywhere. The roars kept coming, echoing across the forest canopy. One would shout, and another would answer. They were communicating, telling each other where I was. A branch snagged my leg, and I went down hard, sliding through dry leaves and pine needles. Pain shot through my knees and palms. I scrambled back to my feet, limping but not stopping. Couldn't stop. The forest thinned, and suddenly I was on a rocky slope. Loose stones shifted under my boots as I stumbled forward. I half ran, half slid downhill, sending small rocks tumbling ahead of me. My breath came in ragged gasps, every heartbeat pounding in my ears. Below me, the ravine dropped into a narrow gully maybe 6 feet deep. Without thinking, I leapt, landing hard on the far side and rolling over the ground. My shoulder slammed against something sharp, a rock or a broken branch, and pain shot through me, but I forced myself up and kept moving. Behind me came a loud crash. One of them had followed me into the gully. I didn't look back. I just ran. My vision was starting to tunnel. Everything around me dimmed. My lungs felt full of shattered glass. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. But I kept going. Then, through the trees ahead, I saw the glint of sunlight on moving water. The river. A surge of energy shot through me. The river meant safety. I didn't know why, but something deep in my brain told me that if I could just reach the water, I'd be all right. The ground sloped steeply, now steeper with every step. I was running almost out of control, my feet barely touching the earth. The trees were thinning. The sound of rushing water grew louder. Behind me, the screams rose to a crescendo, all three voices at once, so loud it felt like they were inside my head. I heard more crashes, branches breaking, heavy bodies closing the distance. 20 yards from the river, 15. I broke through the last stand of trees and saw the torrent below. The bank was a steep drop, maybe 10 feet above the water. I didn't slow down. I hurled myself over the edge. For an instant, I was weightless. Then I hit the water. The cold slammed into me like a wall, total and instant. Momentum dragged me under and tumbled me end over end. I lost all sense of up or down. My soaked clothes were pulling me under. Water flooded my mouth and nose. My lungs screamed for air. I kicked and clawed at the current, fighting to orient myself. My hand struck something, a rock, and I shoved off it, pushing toward what I prayed was the surface. My head broke through. I gasped and choked, dragging in air and water at the same time. The current swept me downstream fast. I couldn't see clearly, my eyes were streaming, but I could still hear the roars from the bank. I went under again, slammed my knee against a submerged rock, so hard pain flared up my leg, then surfaced coughing, barely able to breathe. The river was carrying me away from the spot where I jumped. I let it, anything to put distance between me and them. I tried to angle toward the far bank, the one I'd started from that morning, the side where my camp was, but the water was too strong. I went under a third time. My hand found something, maybe a branch, maybe a root, and I clung to it. I lifted my head and realized I was in mid-river, about 50 yards downstream from where I'd entered. The water here was chest deep, the current still strong but not as violent. I forced myself toward the bank, one step at a time, fighting the pull of the river. My clothes were leaden, my boots sloshing with water, but I kept moving. Step by step, the water grew shallower, waist, hips, knees. I dragged myself onto the mud and collapsed. My whole body shook from cold, from exhaustion, from fear. I coughed up river water and lay there gasping. Then I heard it, their screams echoing across the water. I forced my head up and looked back. All three of them stood on the opposite bank, the bank I'd just come from. They were at the water's edge, about 60 meters upstream, staring at me. The big one stood closest to the river, one massive foot in the shallows, the water only to its ankles, but it didn't go any farther. It just stood there, its chest heaving, eyes locked on me. The other two were behind it, a little higher up the bank. All three were making sounds now, not the screams I'd heard before, but deep, rumbling growls full of anger and frustration. The big one stepped forward into the water, then stopped. I watched from where I lay in the mud, too exhausted to move. It took another step back onto the shore, then forward again, both feet sinking into the shallows before retreating once more. It was testing the water or testing itself. It wanted to come after me, but something was holding it back. The smaller one, the one I'd seen it touch gently before, moved up beside it. It made a low sound, almost questioning. The big one snapped back with a sharp, guttural growl, then turned and let out a longer, more complex series of sounds to the others. They were communicating, talking about me maybe. I pushed myself up to a sitting position. Every muscle screamed in protest. My clothes clung to me, heavy and dripping. My skin was smeared with mud and blood. My knees throbbed from where I'd hit the rocks. But I was alive. Across the river, they were still there. Three figures, motionless but watchful. The leader stepped farther into the water, the current foaming around its shins. Its massive hands clenched into fists as it growled again, low and furious. But it didn't cross. It just stood there, half in the river, the rushing water swirling around its legs, staring at me with those intelligent, furious eyes. Minutes passed. Neither of us moved. Time felt suspended, the two of us locked in a silent standoff. The only sounds were the roar of the current between us and my ragged, uneven breathing. Then I began to understand. They weren't going to cross. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe the river was a boundary, something more than physical. I didn't know if it was instinct, a learned rule, or simply that they couldn't swim. But for whatever reason, the water was keeping them back. The smaller one edged closer to the water and made a sound unlike any I'd heard before, low, mournful, almost sad. The big one tilted its head slightly toward it and answered with a softer rumble. Then it reached out again and touched the smaller one's shoulder, the same gentle gesture I'd seen in the clearing. They were communicating, comforting, maybe explaining. The small one could have been young, a child, asking why they weren't following, and the leader was telling it why they couldn't. I sat there in the mud, watching, and though fear still coursed through me, something else began to take hold: recognition. These weren't mindless beasts. They felt. They had relationships, rules, something like morality. The leader looked at me one more time. Our eyes met again, just as they had in the ravine. For a long moment, neither of us looked away. Then it took a step back, then another. It turned, finally breaking eye contact, but its head lingered toward me for a few more seconds before it let out a short call to the others. Then it began walking upstream, along the riverbank parallel to the water. The other two followed. I watched them go, dark, towering silhouettes moving through the trees on the opposite side. Every 50 feet or so, one would glance back, making sure I wasn't following. Then they disappeared into the forest. For a long while, I could still hear them, branches breaking, the occasional distant call, and then even that faded. I sat there long after they were gone. The sun was high now, warm against my face. Steam rose faintly from my soaked clothes, but I was still shaking. I don't know how long I stayed by that riverbank, 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the cold forced me to move. I had to get back to camp, get dry, warm up before hypothermia set in. Standing was agony. Every joint ached. My knee was swollen, my shoulder throbbed where I'd hit the rock, and the cuts on my hands and face stung as I moved. But I stood. And I started walking downstream, back toward where I'd crossed that morning. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like one of them. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see shapes moving through the trees on the far bank. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of the wilderness, the birds calling again, squirrels chattering, the world returning to itself, as if nothing had ever happened. It took me over an hour to get back to camp. That last half mile felt endless. When I finally saw my little tent through the trees, I almost cried with relief. Inside, I peeled off my wet clothes and pulled on the only dry set I had left. My hands trembled as I dug through my emergency kit and did what I could for the cuts and scrapes. My knee was badly bruised but not broken. My shoulder, too. I'd been lucky. I built a fire with shaking hands, coaxing a flame until it caught, and huddled close to the warmth. It felt like heaven. I boiled water and made coffee, forcing myself to focus on small, ordinary tasks, anything to stop thinking about what had just happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the three figures by the river, about the marks on the trees, the way they coordinated their chase, the sounds they made to each other, the look in the big one's eyes as it stood at the water's edge, wanting to come after me but held back by something unseen. As the sun climbed higher and my shivering finally eased, I tried to make sense of it all. I had followed them more than a mile into their territory. I had watched them share food. I had seen proof they shaped their environment, building, marking, creating. And when they caught me, they drove me off like any animal defending its ground. Only they weren't animals. They were something else, something in between. I thought about going back for my rifle lying somewhere on that mountainside where I'd dropped it, but the idea of returning to that forest, of crossing that river again, made my stomach churn. The gun wasn't worth it. Nothing was. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent jolted me awake. I kept expecting to hear their screams, to feel them charging through my camp. But nothing happened. The night stayed quiet. In the morning, I packed up. I didn't even bother breaking the tent down properly, just stuffed it into my pack. I started the hike back to my truck, 12 miles away. I covered the distance in record time, practically jogging the last few miles. When I reached the trailhead and saw my truck sitting there, I nearly kissed it. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing, hands gripping the steering wheel. Then I started the engine and drove off without looking back. That was 3 months ago. Now I'm home again. Back to normal life. I go to work, I eat dinner, I watch TV. Everything is the same except it isn't. I can't stop thinking about what I saw. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, that roar still echoing in my head. Sometimes at the grocery store, I'll see a tall man at the far end of an aisle, and my heart will race before I realize he's just a normal person. I haven't told the full story to anyone. What would I even say? That I saw 3 Bigfoots fishing in a river and then they chased me? Who would believe that? I've told a few friends I almost ran into a bear. They seem to buy that. I've pored over maps and satellite images of the area, trying to pin down exactly where that river was, where their cave might be, but I can't. The wilderness out there is vast, and I doubled back so many times during the chase. Everything looks the same from above. Part of me wants to go back, to find evidence, to prove what's out there. But the bigger part of me knows how foolish that would be. They let me go. They drove me to the river and then stopped. That was their mercy. Going back would be like spitting on it. Sometimes I wonder about them, the big one and the 2 smaller ones. Are they still out there on that mountain, fishing the same river? Do they remember the human who wandered into their territory? Do they tell the story to their own kind, the stranger who followed them and then fled? I think about the marks on the trees, the bent saplings forming arches, the stacked stones, signs of intelligence, of culture, of a society we know nothing about. They live alongside us out there, deep in the wilderness. And I keep thinking back to that moment on the riverbank when the big one stood in the shallows and we looked at each other. In its eyes, I saw recognition, not just awareness, but understanding. It knew who I was just as surely as I knew what it was. Two different beings meeting for a heartbeat, both of us trying to figure out how to handle the other. I don't even know if I believe in the word Bigfoot anymore. It sounds wrong, too much tied to blurry photos, late-night TV, and myths. But I know what I saw. I know those three creatures were real. I know they had language, tools, and emotions. I know they let me live when they could have killed me. And I know I will never forget the sight of them standing in that river, catching fish with their bare hands as the first light of morning filtered through the trees. Whoever they are, they changed me, changed the way I see the world. There are things out there we cannot understand, things that exist in the space between what we know and what we think is possible. I haven't gone hunting since that day, haven't even been camping. My friends ask why, if I'm all right. I tell them, I'm just taking a break. Maybe someday I'll go back to the wilderness, but not to those mountains. Never to those mountains. Sometimes the rational part of my brain tries to explain it away. Maybe they were people in costumes, an elaborate hoax. But that doesn't account for the way they moved, the strength it would take to fish like that, to chase me through the forest, to bend living trees into arches. No one could fake those things. And it certainly doesn't explain the signs, the old weathered markers high up on the trees, the fresh gouges oozing sap, the intelligence in their eyes. No, what I saw was real. As real as the scars on my arms, the dull ache in my knee, the nightmares that still wake me up 3 times a week. I've put away the maps I pored over, trying to locate that river, that cave. Sometimes, late at night, I take them out and stare, trying to remember exactly where I'd been, trying to find the place on satellite images. But it's impossible. The forest is too dense, the terrain too complex. And maybe that's for the best. They have their world, we have ours. For a few terrifying hours, those worlds overlapped. I wandered into their territory and paid the price. They could have ended me. They didn't. They stopped at the river. They respected that boundary even in anger. That tells me something. It tells me they have rules, customs, maybe even laws, things that govern their behavior beyond mere animal instinct. The river meant something to them. Maybe it's always been the boundary between their world and ours. Maybe it's sacred. Maybe crossing it is forbidden. I'll never know. And that's the hardest part, living with questions that will never have answers. Who are they? Where did they come from? How many are out there? Do they have families, communities, history? All I know for sure is what I saw. 3 massive, intelligent beings living deep in the wilderness, fishing the river, sharing their catch, defending their territory, living lives completely apart from human civilization. And I know they let me go. They chased me to the edge of their world and then stopped. They let me return to mine. Sometimes I think about that big one standing in the shallows, water swirling around its legs, its eyes locked on mine. That moment of mutual recognition, 2 intelligent creatures acknowledging each other across a boundary neither of us could truly cross. I wonder if it thinks about that moment too. If somewhere up in those mountains, it's standing by that same river, remembering the human who stumbled into its world and ran. Maybe it's telling the story to the younger one, teaching it about boundaries, strangers, and mercy. Or maybe it's forgotten me completely, just another intruder driven off. I don't know. I'll never know. But I know I survived. I know I saw something most people will never see. And I know that out there, somewhere in the vast wild, there are beings living alongside us that we can't explain. Beings who fish at dawn, mark the trees, and speak to one another in ways we can't comprehend. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries. There are places in this world that are meant to remain untouched. There are boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. I learned that the hard way, running for my life through those mountains with 3 giant beings screaming behind me. But I learned it, and I'm grateful I lived long enough to remember it. These days, I choose shorter hikes, closer to civilization. I tell myself it's temporary, that someday I'll work up the courage to go deep into the wilderness again, but I'm not sure I ever will. Part of me is still standing on that riverbank, watching 3 towering shapes disappear into the trees, knowing how close I came to never making it home. That fear may have saved my life. It made me drop the rifle and run faster. It made me leap into that freezing river without hesitation. It gave me strength I didn't know I had. And now it keeps me away from their territory. It keeps me from making the same mistake twice. Maybe one day I'll tell the full story. Maybe when I'm old, sitting by a campfire, I'll tell my grandchildren about the time I saw 3 Sasquatches fishing in a mountain river, how I followed them into the hills and barely escaped. But they probably won't believe me. I can hardly believe it myself. Yet I was there. I felt the river's icy grip. I heard their screams echoing through the forest. I saw the intelligence in those eyes. Without evidence, it's just another story, another tale about strange creatures in the woods. Another person claiming to have seen Bigfoot, and maybe that's fine. Maybe the world needs these stories, these mysteries. Maybe we need to know there are still places uncharted, things uncatalogued, beings unexplained. Because if everything could be explained, if every mystery could be solved, if every creature could be captured, studied, and dissected, what would be left? Where would the wonder go? The feeling that the world is bigger than we are? That nature still keeps secrets we cannot reach? I found that wonder in the worst possible way in the terror of running for my life. But I found it, and now I carry it with me every day. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I can't sleep, I close my eyes and find myself back behind that cedar tree, watching 3 immense creatures fish in the dawn light before the chase, before the horror, before everything went wrong. That's the image I try to hold on to. Not the screams, not the pursuit, not the fear, just the moment of pure astonishment, before everything changed. 3 beings that shouldn't exist doing something simple and timeless, catching fish in a river. That's what I saw. That's what I'll carry for the rest of my life. And if I ever start to doubt it, if I ever wonder whether it was all a dream or a hallucination, I just touch the scar on my knee. Feel the ache in my shoulder on cold mornings. Remember the exact snap of that branch under my boot. It was real. All of it was real. And somewhere up in those mountains, I like to think they remember too.